In the shadowed hollows of the Missouri Ozarks during the spring of 1878, where the Civil War's bitter legacy still haunted every ridge and valley like the restless spirits of the fallen, experienced mountain hunter Ezekiel Harwick tracked what he initially believed to be an unusually large wild boar through terrain that grew more ominous with each passing mile. The tracks he followed defied every assumption he had made during 23 years of hunting these ancient mountains, pressed so deeply into the soft earth that they suggested a creature of impossible size and weight, with hoofprints that measured over 8 inches in length and showed the distinctive dual dew claw pattern that marked the European ancestry of feral swine populations. Throughout the region, Harwick was not a man given to supernatural speculation or the kind of folklore that entertained women and children during long winter evenings around cabin hearths. But as he followed the creature's trail deeper into territory that even experienced woodsmen avoided, he began to understand that he was pursuing something that exceeded the normal boundaries of natural history. The damaged vegetation along the trail showed evidence of feeding patterns that suggested systematic destruction rather than random foraging, with entire saplings uprooted and scattered as if by malicious intent rather than simple hunger. The destination of this trail was a mist-shrouded valley that local settlers called Razorback Hollow, though none would explain the origin of that ominous name or why they crossed themselves when forced to mention it in conversation. The hollow itself was a natural depression carved into the mountainside by geological forces that predated human settlement by millennia, its steep sides covered with virgin timber that had never felt the bite of an axe, because those who knew the region's secrets understood that some places were better left undisturbed. So the approach to Razorback Hollow filled Harwick with unease that had nothing to do with rational assessment of hunting dangers and everything to do with primitive instincts that warned him he was entering territory where normal rules did not apply. The forest grew increasingly silent as he descended into the valley, with none of the bird songs or small animal movements that characterized healthy woodland ecosystems. Even the insects seemed subdued, their usual humming reduced to an occasional buzz that sounded more like warnings than natural communication. It was in this unnatural silence that Harwick first encountered old Tusker, the boar patriarch whose supernatural size and intelligence had earned him legendary status among the handful of mountain folk who had glimpsed him and survived to tell the tale. The creature emerged from morning mist that clung to the hollow's depths like smoke from some primordial fire, standing nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder with a body mass that Harwick estimated at over 600 pounds. But it was not the boar's impossible size that stopped Harwick's breath and made his experienced hunting hands tremble on his rifle stock. It was the intelligence that burned in, those yellow eyes like flames from hell itself. This was not the simple cunning that characterized successful predators, but something approaching human consciousness, trapped within a form that nature had never intended to house such awareness. The creature studied Harwick with the calculating attention of a general evaluating enemy positions, its massive head tilting as if considering various options for dealing with this intrusion into its domain. The tusks that gave old Tusker his name were works of natural art, transformed into instruments of supernatural menace, curved like Turkish scimitars and gleaming with a whiteness that seemed to absorb and reflect light, according to principles that exceeded normal bone composition. These were not simply large versions of normal boar tusks, but weapons that had grown beyond biological necessity into something that served purposes beyond mere feeding or territorial defense. The confrontation between hunter and prey lasted perhaps 30 seconds, during which Harwick found himself unable to raise his rifle or make any aggressive movement that might trigger an attack from a creature whose supernatural nature was becoming increasingly apparent. Old Tusker's gaze penetrated through layers of human civilization and military experience to reach primitive fears that dwelt in the deepest recesses of evolutionary memory, reminding Harwick that his species had once been prey to forces that modern life had taught him to forget. When the boar finally disappeared back into the mist that had produced him, moving with silence that defied his massive bulk, Harwick was left with the knowledge that he had encountered something that existed outside the normal categories of wildlife management and hunting expertise. His hands shook for an hour after the encounter, not from fear of death, which he had faced many times during his military service, but from confrontation with something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of animal consciousness and the boundaries between natural and supernatural. The journey back to civilization took Harwick through terrain that he had traveled countless times before. But now every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes, while every sound suggested pursuit by things that moved beyond the range of human perception. By the time he reached the cabin of Granny Mooncrow, the local conjure woman whose knowledge of hidden things had earned her the respect and fear of mountain communities throughout 3 counties. Harwick's need for answers had overcome his lifelong skepticism about supernatural matters. Granny Mooncrow was a woman whose age could not be determined through normal observation, her weathered face and silver hair suggesting decades of mountain life, while her bright eyes and energetic movements indicated reserves of vitality that seemed to draw from sources beyond mere physical health. Her cabin, built into a hillside that provided natural protection from winter storms, was filled with the tools and materials of traditional Ozark conjuring. Dried herbs hanging from every available beam, bottles filled with mysterious preparations that caught and reflected candlelight in disturbing ways, and books written in languages that predated English settlement of the region. The story that Granny Mooncrow told in response to Harwick's questions about Razorback Hollow revealed a history of supernatural corruption that stretched back to the darkest days of the Civil War, when desperate men had turned to forces beyond human understanding in their attempts to survive the chaos that was consuming their world. A group of Confederate deserters, fleeing both Union forces and their own military authorities, had taken refuge in the hollow and established a hidden camp where they hoped to wait out the war's conclusion. But mere survival had not satisfied these men, whose months of brutal warfare had eroded whatever moral constraints had previously governed their behavior. Led by a former preacher who had lost his faith along with his sanity during the siege of Vicksburg, they began experimenting with rituals that drew upon both corrupted Christian theology and older traditions that predated European settlement of the mountains. They called upon things that should never be summoned by mortal men. Granny Mooncrow explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed forces that exceeded human comprehension. Spirits of violence and hunger that had been waiting since the world's beginning for the chance to manifest in physical form. The hollow became a thin place where the barriers between worlds grew weak, and what they summoned took root in the wildlife that had once been innocent. The rituals had focused their malevolent energy upon a massive boar that had already been unnaturally large due to the rich feeding available in the hollow's sheltered environment. This creature, already dominant among the local feral hog population through natural advantages of size and aggression, became the vessel for accumulated supernatural energy that transformed it from simple predator into something that transcended normal animal consciousness. Old Tusker's transformation had been gradual but relentless, with each passing season bringing new developments in size, intelligence, and supernatural ability that made him increasingly dangerous to any human who ventured into his territory. But more significantly, the supernatural corruption that had claimed him began affecting his offspring, with each new generation showing enhancements that exceeded what genetics alone could have produced. The curse passes through blood and bone, Granny Mooncrow continued, her voice dropping to whispers that seemed to come from depths beyond her physical form. Each piglet born in that hollow carries more of the darkness than its parents, growing larger, smarter, and more dangerous with every generation. What began as one corrupted animal has become a dynasty of monsters that will spread beyond the hollow unless something is done to stop them. The Conjure woman's warning about the expanding threat came with specific details that demonstrated her supernatural awareness of events occurring beyond normal observation. She knew that old Tusker's latest mate had given birth to a litter of 7 piglets during the previous autumn, each showing signs of supernatural enhancement that exceeded their sire's original transformation. These new generations were not content to remain within the hollow's boundaries, but were beginning to explore territory that brought them into increasing contact with human settlements. Harwick's encounter with old Tusker had been deliberately orchestrated by the boar patriarch as a form of reconnaissance, testing human response to his presence while evaluating potential threats to his expanding dynasty. The intelligence that had burned in those supernatural eyes was planning for conflict on a scale that exceeded simple territorial disputes between species as spring progressed and reports began reaching mountain communities about attacks on isolated homesteads by boars that showed impossible coordination and strategic thinking. Harwick understood that his chance meeting with old Tusker had been the opening move in a war between human civilization and forces that had learned to use nature itself as a weapon against its former masters. The curse that had taken root in Razorback Hollow was no longer content to remain hidden in the mist-shrouded depths where it had originated, but was beginning to spread like infection through the ancient mountains, carried by creatures that combined supernatural malevolence with the reproductive capacity to ensure that each generation would be more dangerous than the last. Summer brought with it escalating reports of attacks throughout the Missouri Ozarks that challenged every assumption experienced woodsmen had made about the behavior and capabilities of feral swine populations, while the expanding range of old Tuskers' supernatural offspring created a reign of terror that forced entire communities to reconsider their relationship with the wilderness that surrounded their isolated homesteads. The second generation of Razorback descendants had inherited not only their patriarch's impossible size and intelligence, but had developed new abilities that suggested continuing evolution beyond anything natural selection could have produced. Dr. Nathaniel Gross arrived in the region during the first week of June, dispatched by the Missouri State Agricultural College to investigate reports of unusually large and aggressive wild boars that were allegedly decimating livestock populations and forcing the abandonment of previously productive farming operations. As a trained naturalist with extensive experience documenting wildlife populations throughout the American frontier, Dr. Cross approached the assignment with scientific skepticism, tempered by professional curiosity about phenomena that might represent previously unknown subspecies or unusual behavioral adaptations. The initial reports that Dr. Cross collected from local authorities seemed to support conventional explanations for increased human-wildlife conflict, expanding feral hog populations competing for limited resources, habitat destruction forcing animals into closer contact with human settlements, and the kind of exaggerated folklore that characterized frontier communities where dangerous wildlife encounters were transformed into legends through repeated telling. But as his investigation progressed and he began interviewing witnesses whose credibility could not be easily dismissed, the naturalist found himself confronting evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal behavior and intelligence. The attacks that had terrorized the region throughout the spring and early summer showed patterns of coordination and strategic planning that exceeded anything in scientific literature about swine behavior, even among the most intelligent domestic breeds that had been selectively bred for cognitive enhancement. Multiple witnesses described incidents where groups of boars had worked together to isolate individual humans or livestock, with some animals serving as drivers while others established ambush positions along predicted escape routes. Martha Kensington, whose homestead near Lost Creek had been attacked during the third week of May, provided testimony that demonstrated the supernatural nature of the creatures that now roamed beyond Razorback Hollow's original boundaries. Her account described boars that moved with coordination, suggesting telepathic communication, animals that seemed to anticipate human responses and adjust their tactics accordingly, and most disturbing of all, creatures that appeared to take pleasure in terrorizing their victims before administering final attacks. They weren't just hunting for food. Mrs. Kensington explained to Dr. Cross during his interview at the temporary shelter where she and her family had taken refuge. These creatures were playing with us like cats with mice. They would surround the cabin and make noise all night long, keeping us awake and scared, then disappear just before dawn. This went on for weeks before they finally attacked during broad daylight, killing our livestock while we watched from inside the house. The systematic nature of the harassment, described by Mrs. Kensington and other survivors, suggested that the Razorback descendants had developed sophisticated psychological warfare techniques that serve purposes beyond simple predation. The creatures seemed to understand that prolonged terror could be more effective than immediate violence in driving humans away from territory that they wanted to claim for their expanding range. Dr. Cross's scientific examination of physical evidence left behind by the attacks revealed anatomical abnormalities that challenged every principle of mammalian biology he had learned. During his formal education, tusk marks found on damaged structures showed weapons that had grown far beyond the normal size limitations that governed wild boar development, while hoofprints pressed into soft earth demonstrated body weights that should have been impossible for creatures with the skeletal structure of domestic swine. Most puzzling were the behavioral artifacts that suggested the boars had developed cultural traditions that were being passed from one generation to the next through teaching, rather than instinct. At multiple attack sites, Dr. Cross discovered evidence that the creatures had arranged damaged property and animal remains in geometric patterns that seemed to serve communicative or ritualistic purposes rather than simple feeding behaviors. The bone arrangements found at the Kensington homestead were particularly disturbing, showing systematic organization that implied understanding of symbolic representation and abstract concepts that should have been beyond the cognitive capacity of any known animal species. Livestock bones had been sorted by size and type, then arranged in circular patterns around central deposits of inedible materials that served no obvious practical purpose but might have functioned as primitive altars or territorial markers. These patterns are not random. Dr. Cross wrote in his confidential field notes, using code words to prevent casual readers from understanding the full implications of his observations. They show evidence of planning, symbolic thinking, and cultural transmission that would be remarkable in primates, impossible in ungulates. Either we are dealing with previously unknown species with cognitive abilities that exceed current scientific understanding, or we are confronting phenomena that exist outside the normal boundaries of natural history. The expansion of the Razorback Dynasty's territory during the summer months followed strategic principles that demonstrated understanding of human settlement patterns and resource distribution throughout the region. Rather than expanding randomly in all directions, the creatures concentrated their activities along river valleys and established transportation routes that provided access to multiple human communities, while offering escape routes back to the protective environment of Razorback Hollow. Ezekiel Harwick's attempts to track and eliminate individual members of the growing Razorback population met with failure that confirmed the supernatural nature of his quarry, while demonstrating that conventional hunting methods were inadequate for dealing with creatures that combined animal senses with strategic intelligence. His carefully planned ambushes were consistently evaded by boars that seemed capable of detecting human presence from impossible distances. while his attempts to track them through their natural habitat were frustrated by creatures that could move through dense forest without leaving detectable trails. More disturbing still were the signs that the Razorbacks were hunting Harwick in return, using their superior knowledge of local terrain to set traps and establish ambush positions that would have been successful if not for the mountain hunter's decades of experience with dangerous game. On 3 separate occasions, Harwick found himself being stalked by creatures that demonstrated understanding of human psychology and tactical thinking that exceeded the capabilities of trained military scouts. The psychological pressure of being hunted by super-intelligent predators began affecting Harwick's mental stability in ways that made him question his own perceptions while driving him toward obsessive behavior that concerned everyone who knew him. Sleep became impossible without protective measures that would have seemed superstitious to his former self, while every sound in the forest took on ominous significance that made normal woodcraft impossible to maintain. "They know me now," Harwick confided to Dr. Cross during one of their meetings at Granny Mooncrow's cabin. "They've studied my methods and learned my patterns. Every time I set up to hunt them, they're already waiting for me to arrive. It's like they can see inside my head and know what I'm planning before I do." The naturalists. Documentation of similar reports from other experienced hunters throughout the region confirmed that the Razorback dynasty was not simply avoiding human predation, but was actively engaging in counterintelligence operations that demonstrated cognitive abilities far beyond anything known to exist in the animal kingdom. These creatures had apparently learned to recognize individual humans, remember their behavioral patterns, and develop specific countermeasures for each person who posed a potential threat to their expanding territory. By late summer, 3 entire homesteads had been abandoned as families fled, rather than continue facing nightly harassment from creatures that seemed capable of psychological warfare as sophisticated as any human military unit. The economic impact of these abandonments rippled throughout the local community, reducing property values and disrupting agricultural production in ways that threatened the viability of settlements that had existed peacefully for decades. The Lost Creek settlement, closest to Razorback Hollow and therefore most vulnerable to attack, began organizing defensive measures that acknowledged the supernatural nature of their enemy while attempting to maintain some semblance of normal community life. Families moved into shared accommodations that provided better security, while men organized patrol schedules designed to provide early warning of razorback incursions into settled areas. But even these defensive measures proved inadequate against creatures that could coordinate their attacks across multiple locations simultaneously, stretching human resources beyond their capacity to respond effectively. The psychological warfare that preceded physical attacks had eroded community morale to the point where many residents were actively planning evacuation rather than continuing to resist. Enemies whose capabilities seemed to increase with each passing week as autumn approached and the Razorback dynasty prepared for winter by intensifying their territorial expansion. Dr. Cross compiled evidence that would force the scientific community to reconsider fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence and the boundaries between natural and supernatural phenomena. His documented observations of creatures that exhibited problem-solving abilities, cultural transmission and strategic thinking that exceeded human capabilities in some areas, represented challenges to accepted biological theory that would require decades of additional research to fully understand, but understanding the nature of the threat would prove less important than developing effective methods for combating creatures whose supernatural evolution had given them advantages that conventional wildlife management techniques were powerless to address. The descent into Razorback Hollow during the crisp October morning of 1878 marked the beginning of what would become the most horrific hunting expedition in Missouri Ozark history, as Ezekiel Harwick led 5 experienced mountain men into territory that had been claimed by forces beyond human understanding and transformed into a nightmare landscape where natural laws had been suspended in favor of supernatural malevolence. The hunting party that followed Harwick down the mist-shrouded trail included men whose collective experience encompassed decades of dangerous game hunting, military service, and frontier survival. But none were prepared for the revelations that awaited them. In the corrupted heart of the Razorback, Dynasty's domain, the hunters had spent 3 days preparing for the expedition with supplies and weapons selected specifically for confronting large, dangerous game in challenging terrain. Their arsenal included heavy-caliber rifles capable of stopping brown bears, specialized ammunition designed for maximum stopping power, and backup weapons that provided multiple options for close-quarters combat. Each man carried sufficient provisions for a week-long hunt, along with rope, axes, and other tools that might be needed for tracking wounded animals through dense forest or extracting trophies from successful kills. But as the hunting party descended deeper into the hollow and the familiar sounds of normal forest life gave way to the unnatural silence that characterized the Razorback Dynasty's territory, experienced woodsmen who had faced grizzly bears and mountain lions, without flinching, began to understand that they were entering an environment where their accumulated knowledge and carefully chosen equipment might prove inadequate for challenges that exceeded natural categories. The first sign that Razorback Hollow had been transformed into something beyond normal wildlife habitat came when the hunters discovered trees that had been systematically damaged in ways that served no obvious biological purpose, but suggested deliberate modification according to principles that transcended simple territorial marking. Ancient oaks and hickories bore scars from tusks that measured over 2 feet in length, carved in patterns that resembled primitive writing or ritual symbols rather than random damage from feeding or territory establishment. Isaac Mosley, the most experienced tracker in the group, stopped the party's advance to examine marks that had been cut into the bark of a massive white oak with precision that exceeded what any animal should have been capable of achieving. The symbols were not random scratches, but deliberate engravings that formed geometric patterns repeating across multiple trees in ways that suggested conscious design and possibly communicative intent. "These aren't feeding marks or territory signs," Mosley whispered, his voice carrying the uncertainty of a man whose expertise was being challenged by evidence that exceeded his understanding. "Something made these on purpose, following a pattern like it was writing a message. But what kind of animal knows how to write?" The question that Mosley posed would have seemed absurd in any other context, but the evidence scattered throughout the hollow's depths forced the hunting party to consider possibilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence and the boundaries between instinct and conscious thought. The tree carvings were only the beginning of discoveries that would reveal the extent to which supernatural forces had corrupted natural processes within the Razorback Dynasty's expanding territory as the hunters pressed deeper into the hollow, following trails that showed signs of heavy use by creatures whose hoofprints measured dimensions that defied normal swine anatomy. They began encountering wallows that exceeded anything in their collective experience with wild boar behavior. These were not simple mudholes created for cooling and parasite control, but elaborate excavations that had been shaped according to geometric principles and arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic rather than biological purposes. The largest of these wallows, designated by the hunters as the Bone Wallow due to its disturbing contents, was a circular depression nearly 30 feet in diameter that had been carved into the hollow's floor with precision that suggested the use of tools rather than simple rooting behavior. The walls of this excavation showed marks from tusks that had been employed with systematic efficiency to achieve specific architectural goals. creating a structure that resembled a primitive amphitheater more than an animal wallow, but it was the contents of the bone wallow that revealed the true horror of what the Razorback dynasty had become during their supernatural evolution. Human remains, some showing signs of recent deposition, while others had been weathered by seasons of exposure, had been arranged in patterns that clearly indicated conscious organization, according to principles that served purposes beyond simple disposal of feeding remnants. The bones had been sorted by size and type, with skulls forming the center of concentric circles, while long bones radiated outward in patterns that resembled the spokes of a wheel or the points of a compass. Smaller bones filled the spaces between these larger elements, creating geometric designs that would have required extensive planning and sophisticated understanding of spatial relationships to achieve. "My God," breathed Samuel Fairchild, the youngest member of the hunting party, whose military service during the final years of the Civil War had exposed him to battlefield carnage that he thought had prepared him for any horror. They're arranging human bones like they're building something, like it's some kind of altar or temple. The implications of Fairchild's observation forced the hunting party to confront the possibility that they were dealing with creatures whose intelligence had developed beyond simple problem-solving into areas that included abstract thought, symbolic representation, and possibly religious or ritualistic behavior. The bone arrangements suggested not just the ability to kill humans, but the capacity to treat those killings as part of larger systems of meaning that transcended mere predation. Dr. Cross's scientific training provided framework for documenting what the hunting party was discovering, but his rational mind struggled to process evidence that challenged every assumption he had made about animal cognition and the limits of non-human intelligence. The geometric precision of the bone arrangements required mathematical understanding that exceeded what any known animal species possessed, while the systematic nature of the deposits suggested cultural traditions that were being maintained across multiple generations. The hunters' exploration of the hollow's deeper recesses revealed additional evidence that the Razorback dynasty had developed civilization of sorts, with specialized areas that served specific functions within their supernatural society. Feeding areas had been established in locations that provided strategic advantages for hunting while offering protection from potential human retaliation, while sleeping areas showed modifications that suggested understanding of defensive architecture and tactical positioning. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of what appeared to be a nursery area where the Razorback dynasty's youngest members were being raised according to systematic principles that included education in hunting techniques, territorial navigation, and possibly the symbolic behaviors that characterized their parents' activities. Young boars, already showing signs of supernatural enhancement despite their age, could be observed practicing coordinated movements that resembled military drill, while older animals provided instruction that went far beyond simple behavioral modeling. The first attack on the hunting party came without warning, despite their careful surveillance of the surrounding territory, demonstrating that the Razorbacks possess sensory capabilities or intelligence-gathering methods that exceeded human understanding. 3 massive boars, each standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder and equipped with tusks that gleamed like polished steel, emerged from concealment positions that had been invisible to experienced trackers and launched coordinated assaults that separated the hunters into isolated groups vulnerable to individual attack. Thomas Brennan, whose skill with heavy-caliber rifles had made him legendary among Ozark hunters, managed to fire a single shot that struck the largest attacking boar center mass with enough force to drop a grizzly bear. But the creature absorbed the impact of the 50-caliber bullet with no apparent effect, continuing its charge without visible signs of injury, while its tusks sought the soft flesh of the hunter's throat with surgical precision. The supernatural resilience that the Razorbacks displayed during combat exceeded anything that natural toughness could have provided, suggesting that their transformation had included enhancements to their physical durability that made conventional hunting weapons ineffective. Shots that should have been instantly fatal seemed to cause no more than temporary inconvenience, while wounds that would have disabled natural animals appeared to heal with impossible rapidity. But more terrifying than their physical invulnerability was the tactical intelligence that the Razorbacks demonstrated during their assault on the hunting party. Rather than attacking with the simple fury that characterized normal animal aggression, they employed sophisticated strategies that included feints, diversions, and coordinated movements that suggested communication methods beyond anything known to exist in the animal kingdom. The battle that followed was less a hunting expedition than a military engagement between human soldiers and supernatural enemies whose capabilities exceeded conventional understanding of animal behavior. 3 hunters died during the first assault, their bodies torn apart by tusks that cut through bone and sinew with the efficiency of industrial machinery, while the survivors found themselves fighting for their lives against creatures that seemed to anticipate their every move. Isaac Mosley's death provided the most chilling evidence of the Razorbacks' supernatural intelligence, as the experienced tracker was systematically hunted down by creatures that demonstrated understanding of human psychology and tactical thinking. Rather than killing him quickly, the Boars seemed to take pleasure in terrorizing their victim, driving him through the hollow's maze-like terrain while cutting off every possible escape route with precision that suggested extensive planning and coordination. When the surviving hunters finally reached Mosley's body, they found evidence that his death had been deliberately prolonged for purposes that exceeded simple predation. The tracker had been systematically mutilated in ways that suggested ritual significance rather than feeding behavior, with specific body parts removed according to patterns that matched the bone arrangements found in the wallow areas. The climactic moment of the expedition's horror came when the surviving hunters witnessed old Tusker himself, directing the final phases of the attack from a position that provided him with tactical overview of the entire battlefield. The boar patriarch stood upright on his hind legs like a human general, using guttural sounds that resembled language to coordinate his offspring's movements while demonstrating strategic thinking that exceeded what many human military commanders could have achieved under similar circumstances. The sight of a 600-pound boar functioning as a military strategist challenged every assumption the hunters had made about the nature of animal intelligence and the boundaries between human and non-human consciousness. This was not simply a large and dangerous predator, but a super-intelligent entity that had learned to use warfare as a tool for achieving goals that transcended simple territorial expansion or resource acquisition. The retreat from Razorback Hollow was accomplished only through the sacrifice of additional hunters who provided covering fire while their companions fled through terrain that seemed designed to channel human movement into predetermined killing zones. By the time the survivors reached safe territory, half the original hunting party had been lost to creatures whose capabilities had exceeded every prediction and challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The evidence that the survivors carried back to civilization would force communities throughout the Missouri Ozarks to reconsider their relationship with the wilderness that surrounded their settlements, while acknowledging that some threats transcended the normal categories of dangerous wildlife to become existential challenges to human survival in regions where supernatural forces had gained footholds in the natural world. Winter descended upon the Missouri Ozarks with unprecedented fury during December of 1878, bringing with it conditions that transformed the already dangerous conflict between human settlements and the Razorback Dynasty into a desperate struggle for survival that would test the limits of both supernatural intelligence and human determination. The extreme cold and heavy snowfall that characterized the season created resource scarcity that drove the Razorback Dynasty to abandon their previous pattern of gradual territorial expansion in favor of direct assaults on human communities that possessed the food stores necessary for surviving the harsh weather. The first major attack on Lost Creek settlement came during the third week of December, when temperatures had dropped below zero and snow depths made travel between homesteads virtually impossible without organized effort. A coordinated assault by over 30 Razorbacks of various generations demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded anything the creatures had previously displayed, with simultaneous strikes on multiple buildings that forced the community's defenders to divide their attention and resources beyond their capacity to respond effectively. Ezekiel Harwick, whose obsession with destroying the Razorback dynasty had consumed every aspect of his existence since the disastrous hunting expedition 2 months earlier, found himself thrust into the role of military commander for a community that lacked both the weapons and training necessary to fight creatures whose supernatural abilities gave them decisive advantages in every category of combat effectiveness. His experience with conventional hunting and his first-hand knowledge of Razorback capabilities made him the settlement's only hope for developing defensive strategies that might prove effective against enemies that seemed to anticipate human responses and adapt their tactics accordingly. The defense of Lost Creek required innovations that combined traditional frontier warfare with supernatural countermeasures provided by Granny Mooncrow, whose extensive knowledge of conjuring techniques offered the only available methods for evening the odds against creatures whose physical and intellectual capabilities exceeded normal human limitations. The Conjure woman's contribution to the community's survival included blessed weapons that might prove effective against supernatural enemies, protective charms that could provide some defense against Razorback intelligence-gathering abilities, and tactical advice based on her understanding of the spiritual forces that had created and sustained the dynasty's power. Iron blessed under the full moon can pierce supernatural hide, Granny Mooncrow explained as she prepared special ammunition for the community's rifles and pistols. But more important than the blessing is the intention behind each shot. These creatures feed on fear and hatred, growing stronger when faced with emotions that match their own nature. You must hunt them with calm determination and protective love for what you're defending, not with the anger and revenge that gives them power over your actions. The spiritual preparation that Granny Mooncrow prescribed for the final confrontation included rituals designed to protect the hunters from psychological manipulation, while enhancing their ability to perceive and respond to supernatural threats that operated beyond normal sensory detection. These ceremonies, conducted in secret to prevent Razorback intelligence from learning about human defensive preparations, combined traditional Ozark conjuring with older practices that predated European settlement of the region. Harwick's acceptance of supernatural assistance marked a fundamental transformation in his worldview. As a man whose entire adult life had been dedicated to rational assessment of natural phenomena, found himself embracing magical practices that challenged every assumption he had made about the relationship between cause and effect. But the evidence of his own senses, combined with the desperate circumstances facing his community, made him willing to employ any method that might prove effective against enemies whose capabilities exceeded conventional understanding. The tracking of old Tusker to his winter stronghold deep within Razorback Hollow required skills that went beyond normal woodcraft to encompass spiritual sensitivity and supernatural awareness that could penetrate the concealment methods employed by creatures whose intelligence included understanding of human sensory limitations. Harwick's preparation for this final hunt involved not just physical conditioning and equipment selection, but psychological and spiritual preparation, designed to enable confrontation with forces that existed beyond normal reality. The blizzard that struck the region during the final week of December created conditions that worked both for and against the human hunters attempting to locate and eliminate the source of the Razorback dynasty's power. The extreme weather reduced visibility and made movement dangerous for all participants in the conflict. But it also concentrated both humans and boars in limited areas where resources necessary for survival could be found and defended. Harwick's approach to old Tuskers. Winter Lair utilized techniques learned during his military service, combined with conjuring methods that Granny Mooncrow had adapted, specifically for hunting supernatural prey. The blessed iron spikes that served as his primary weapons had been forged from metal taken from a church bell and consecrated through rituals that drew upon both Christian and pre-Christian spiritual traditions, creating implements that could theoretically penetrate supernatural defenses while providing protection against mystical retaliation. The final confrontation between hunter and supernatural prey took place in a natural amphitheater carved into the hollow's deepest recesses, where old Tusker had established his winter stronghold, surrounded by the accumulated trophies of his dynasty's reign of terror. Human bones arranged in geometric patterns provided evidence of systematic predation that had claimed dozens of victims, while fresh signs indicated that the boar patriarch was preparing for spring expansion that would extend his territory far beyond its current boundaries. Old Tusker's appearance during the climactic battle revealed the full extent of his supernatural transformation, as the creature that faced Harwick stood nearly 6 feet tall when rearing on his hind legs and possessed tusks that measured over 2 feet in length. But more disturbing than his impossible size was the intelligence that burned in those yellow eyes, an awareness that seemed to encompass not just tactical assessment of immediate threats, but strategic understanding of the broader implications of their conflict. The battle between man and supernatural beast combined physical combat with spiritual warfare, as Harwick's blessed weapons proved capable of inflicting real damage on his enemy, while old Tusker's supernatural abilities included psychological attacks that threatened to overwhelm human consciousness with despair and terror. The struggle lasted for over an hour, with both participants suffering wounds that would have been fatal under normal circumstances, but were sustained through sheer determination and supernatural enhancement, respectively. The decisive moment of the confrontation came when Harwick succeeded in driving one of his blessed iron spikes directly into old Tusker's heart, channeling not just physical force, but spiritual energy that had been accumulated through months of preparation and community support. The weapon's penetration of the boar patriarch's supernatural defenses created a feedback effect that disrupted the mystical connections binding the entire dynasty together, sending psychic shockwaves throughout the hollow that affected every member of the Razorback bloodline. Old Tusker's death was accompanied by phenomena that confirmed the supernatural nature of his transformation while demonstrating the extent to which his personal power had sustained the entire dynasty's enhanced capabilities. The ground shook with seismic activity that had no geological explanation, while the temperature in the immediate area dropped by over 20 degrees as supernatural energy was released back into the environment from which it had been drawn. But even in death, old Tusker achieved a final victory that ensured the continuation of his bloodline's threat to human settlement of the region. His dying actions included a desperate assault on Harwick that provided cover for his pregnant mate to escape into the deeper recesses of the hollow, carrying within her body the next generation of Razorback, descendants who would inherit at least some of their father's supernatural abilities. The psychological impact of old Tusker's death on his surviving offspring was immediate and dramatic, as creatures that had displayed superintelligence and coordinated tactical thinking reverted to behavior patterns that more closely resembled normal wild boar responses to threat and territory disputes. The mystical bonds that had enabled telepathic communication and strategic coordination were severed leaving individual animals that, while still larger and more dangerous than typical feral swine, no longer functioned as components of a unified supernatural entity. Harwick's survival of the final confrontation came at costs that would affect him for the remainder of his life, as exposure to concentrated supernatural energy during his battle with Old Tusker had created permanent changes in his consciousness that made normal human social interaction increasingly difficult. The hunter, who had once been a respected member of his community, became a solitary figure whose obsession with tracking down the surviving members of the Razorback Dynasty consumed every aspect of his existence. The immediate aftermath of the final hunt provided temporary relief for human settlements throughout the region, as the remaining Razorback descendants scattered without their patriarch's coordinating intelligence to maintain territorial cohesion or strategic planning. But the pregnant sow that had escaped carried within her genetic legacy the potential for future supernatural manifestations that might not require the specific conditions that had created Old Tusker's original transformation. The winter that followed Old Tusker's death was characterized by an uneasy peace that allowed human communities to begin recovering from months of terror while remaining vigilant for signs that the Razorback Dynasty's threat might return in new forms that could prove even more dangerous than their original manifestation. The decades that followed Old Tusker's death in the bitter winter of 1878 witnessed the gradual evolution of the Razorback Dynasty's surviving bloodline from localized supernatural threat to regional legend that would influence human settlement patterns throughout the Missouri and Arkansas Ozarks, while providing the foundation for folklore traditions that persisted well into the modern era. The pregnant sow, who had escaped Harwick's final hunt, gave birth to a litter of 7 piglets during the spring of 1879, each showing physical characteristics that confirmed their inheritance of supernatural traits while displaying behavioral patterns that suggested the retention of enhanced intelligence despite the severing of mystical connections that had bound their ancestors into a unified entity. Ezekiel, Harwick's transformation from respected community member to obsessed hermit reflected the psychological costs of confronting supernatural forces that exceeded human capacity to process without permanent mental alteration. The hunter, who had once moved easily through Ozark society, became a solitary figure whose every thought and action centered on tracking down and eliminating the scattered remnants of the Razorback dynasty, pursuing a quest that would consume the remaining 23 years of his life while providing material for legends that portrayed him as both hero and cautionary tale. The isolated cabin that Harwick, constructed in the remote mountains above Razorback Hollow, served as headquarters for hunting expeditions that grew increasingly desperate and irrational as the surviving Razorback descendants proved more elusive and adaptive than their supernatural predecessors. His journals, discovered after his death in 1901, documented encounters with creatures that retained enough of their inherited abilities to frustrate conventional hunting methods while lacking the coordinated intelligence that had made their ancestors predictable in their supernatural malevolence. The bloodline is scattered but not destroyed. Harwick wrote in one of his final journal entries, his handwriting showing the tremor of age and obsession that had marked his final years. Each new generation carries traces of the original curse, growing larger and smarter than natural swine while developing their own methods for surviving human persecution. They have learned to hide their true nature, appearing as normal wild boars until circumstances force them to reveal capabilities that exceed natural limits. The accuracy of Harwick's observations was confirmed by sporadic reports from throughout the Ozark region during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as hunters and settlers encountered feral swine that displayed problem-solving abilities, pack coordination, and apparent ritualistic behaviors that exceeded anything documented in scientific literature about Suscrofa populations. These sightings were typically dismissed as frontier exaggeration or misidentification of normal wildlife, but the consistency of witness accounts across different geographical areas and time periods suggested the persistence of genetic traits that defied conventional biological classification. Dr. Nathaniel Cross's continued research into the Razorback phenomenon, conducted discreetly to avoid professional ridicule while maintaining scientific objectivity about supernatural claims, documented evidence that the original curse had indeed been transmitted through biological inheritance to create a scattered population of enhanced feral swine whose capabilities exceeded normal species parameters in measurable ways. His private papers, preserved in university archives under restricted access provisions, included anatomical drawings and behavioral observations that confirm the existence of creatures whose development had been influenced by forces beyond natural selection. The specimens I have examined show consistent abnormalities that cannot be explained through normal genetic variation or environmental adaptation. Dr. Cross wrote in his confidential research notes, brain case dimensions exceed normal ranges by significant margins, while tusk development follows patterns that suggest continuous growth throughout the animal's lifetime, rather than the normal cessation that characterizes wild boar dental anatomy. Most significantly, behavioral observations indicate problem-solving abilities and social coordination that approach the cognitive capabilities documented in higher primates. The integration of razorback descendants into the broader feral hog populations of the American South occurred gradually over multiple generations, with supernatural traits being diluted through crossbreeding while retaining sufficient concentration to influence the behavioral characteristics of hybrid offspring. Modern wildlife biologists studying the explosive growth of feral swine populations throughout the southeastern United States occasionally encounter specimens that defy normal classification, showing intelligence levels and problem-solving abilities that exceed established parameters for the species. Contemporary research conducted by Dr. Sarah Martinez at the University of Arkansas's Department of Wildlife Biology has documented feral hog populations in remote areas of the Ozark Mountains that display behavioral patterns suggesting cultural transmission of learned behaviors across generational lines. Trail camera footage collected during ongoing studies of habitat utilization and population dynamics has captured images of wild boars engaged in activities that appear to serve ritualistic rather than biological purposes. We're seeing evidence of feral hogs arranging objects in geometric patterns around kill sites, behavior that serves no obvious survival function but appears to be transmitted from adult animals to their offspring. Dr. Martinez explained during a 2019 conference presentation that carefully avoided any reference to supernatural explanations for the phenomena she was documenting. The patterns show consistency across different geographical locations and family groups, suggesting some form of inherited behavioral template that exceeds normal genetic programming. The most compelling evidence for the continued influence of the Razorback dynasty's supernatural legacy comes from game camera footage collected by the Missouri Department of Conservation during routine wildlife monitoring activities in areas adjacent to the original Razorback Hollow. Digital images captured during nighttime hours show groups of unusually large feral swine arranged in formations that exactly match the geometric patterns documented by Howick's hunting party during their 1878 expedition into the hollow's depths. These contemporary sightings occur with sufficient frequency to suggest that the behavioral traits first observed in old Tusker's descendants have been preserved and transmitted through over a century of biological inheritance, creating modern populations that retain traces of their supernatural ancestry while adapting to changed environmental conditions and human settlement patterns. The creatures captured in these images show physical characteristics that confirm their genetic connection to the original Razorback dynasty. including enlarged brain cases, extended tusk development, and body sizes that exceed normal parameters for feral swine populations. The folklore traditions that developed around the Razorback dynasty's historical activities have evolved into cautionary tales that serve both entertainment and practical purposes for contemporary Ozark communities, warning outdoor enthusiasts and hunters about the potential dangers posed by feral hog populations while preserving cultural memory of supernatural events that challenged conventional understanding of natural law. These stories, transmitted through oral tradition and increasingly through digital media, maintain awareness of threats that may not be entirely historical. Modern hunting outfitters operating in the Arkansas and Missouri Ozarks report occasional encounters with feral swine that display intelligence and coordination that exceed normal species capabilities, leading to the development of specialized hunting techniques and safety protocols designed for dealing with animals whose behavior cannot be predicted through conventional wildlife management knowledge. These practical adaptations represent the continuation of human razorback conflict into contemporary times, with modern technology providing tools that Howick and his contemporaries lacked, while the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. The environmental impact of enhanced feral swine populations has created ecological disruption throughout the southeastern United States that exceeds what normal population growth could have produced, suggesting that inherited supernatural traits may include enhanced reproductive success and survival, capabilities that give razorback descendants competitive advantages over both native wildlife and conventional feral hog populations. This biological success has enabled the spread of potentially supernatural genetic material across vast geographical areas, creating the possibility that traits first concentrated in Razorback Hollow may now influence feral swine populations from Texas to North Carolina. The ultimate implications of the Razorback dynasty's continuing influence on American wildlife populations remain unknown, as modern scientific methods are inadequate for detecting and measuring supernatural genetic inheritance, while regulatory agencies lack both the conceptual framework and legal authority necessary for addressing threats that exist outside conventional biological categories. The legacy that began with Civil War deserters practicing dark rituals in a remote Missouri hollow continues to shape ecological and social conditions throughout the American South, ensuring that the tusked terrors passed down through 5 generations of supernatural evolution will continue to challenge human assumptions about the nature of wildlife and the boundaries between natural and supernatural phenomena for generations to come.